the house in Harper's Ferry still stands, or at least the stone footprint of its foundation does, pressed between the cold shoulder of the mountain and the ceaseless murmur of the river. In the winter of 1842, its shadow was a place of profound and terrible silence, a silence that would eventually be broken by the faintest scratching from beneath the floor. A sound so easily dismissed as vermin. A sound that concealed an act of such cold and final defiance that the town, in its wisdom, chose to forget it ever happened. The record, however, remembers. If you are drawn to the quiet whispers of history's darkest chambers, and this is your first time crossing our threshold, consider subscribing. Become a keeper of the archive, and ensure these stories are never truly lost to the silence. The account of Sarah Ann Coleman begins not with a name, but with a number on a ledger. 11 years of age, 4 feet and perhaps 7 inches in height. Valued for her quiet disposition and sturdy frame, deemed suitable for domestic service. The winter of 1842 found her on a buckboard wagon, rattling over the frozen ruts of the road that followed the Potomac River into Harper's Ferry. The air itself was a physical presence, thick with the damp chill rising from the water and laced with the acrid scent of coal smoke and raw iron from the armory downstream. It was a town of stark, unyielding materials. Stone, iron, and unforgiving water. Fog clung to the confluence of the rivers, a spectral breath that blurred the line between the dark, fast-moving water and the heavy, gray sky. It was a landscape that promised little warmth and offered no comfort. A fitting portico for the life that awaited her. She was being delivered to the home of Mr. Thomas Whitley and his wife, a childless couple of some modest means, whose property sat just beyond the main bustle of the town, where the wilderness began to reclaim the land. The purchase was framed as an act of domestic necessity, an acquisition to help the mistress of the house, whose hands, it was said, were too delicate for the rigors of a full household. The girl, Sarah Ann, sat beside the driver, a man whose name she never learned and whose face remained a stoic mask beneath a low-brimmed hat. Her world had been reduced to the immediate and the sensory. The rough weave of the burlap sack at her feet, the rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves on the hardened earth, the way the cold seeped through the thin wool of her shawl. She had already learned the most fundamental lesson of her existence. Silence was a shield. Observation was a tool. To be invisible was to be safe. She watched the trees, their bare branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. She watched the river, its surface a turbulent slate gray, carrying with it the last remnants of autumn's decay. She said nothing. Her thoughts were a quiet, guarded territory, a space she had learned to retreat into when the world outside became too loud, too threatening. She was not a blank canvas upon which a new life would be painted. She was a parchment already inscribed with the harsh calligraphy of loss, a text written in a language of fear and resilience that few could or would ever care to read. The Whitley house emerged from the mist not as a grand plantation manor, but as a severe, 2-story stone structure, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the river. It was a house built for permanence, for enduring the harsh winters and the relentless passage of time. Smoke curled thinly from a single chimney, the only sign of life within. Mr. Thomas Whitley stood on the porch to receive his property. He was a man of meticulous habits, his coat brushed free of any lint, his boots polished to a dull gleam. The one humanizing detail one might have noted about him was the constant, almost unconscious, winding of the silver pocket watch he kept in his waistcoat. It was a small, repetitive motion, a need to impose a measured, mechanical order upon the world around him. He did not look at the girl's face. He looked at her hands, her feet, her teeth, the same way a farmer might inspect new livestock. His assessment was brief, his nod to the driver curt and final. A transaction concluded. He spoke to her only once, his voice as dry as old paper, instructing her to follow him. He said she was to be a companion and helper to his wife. The interior of the house was a study in cold, rigid order. The floors were swept clean, the furniture dark and heavy, its surfaces polished to a mirror shine. It was a place of oppressive neatness, where every object had its designated place, and every moment was governed by an unspoken routine. There was no clutter, no sign of casual, lived-in comfort. It was a museum of a life, not a home. And at the center of this sterile world was the mistress, Eleanor Whitley. She sat in a high-backed chair by the hearth, her hands busy with some delicate needlework. She was a woman whose youth had faded into a brittle porcelain beauty. The lace at her collar was impossibly white, the coils of her hair unnervingly perfect. Her one concession to a life before this rigid discipline was a faint, almost inaudible humming that would sometimes escape her lips when she believed herself to be alone, a fragment of a lullaby from a childhood long since vanished. It was a ghost of a sound in a house that was already full of them. She looked at the child, Sarah Ann, and her eyes, the color of a winter sky, held no welcome. They held only appraisal. The cruelties began not with a blow, but with a gesture. They were subtle, precise, and designed to reinforce the vast, unbridgeable chasm between them. When the mistress handed Sarah Ann a pail or a dust rag, she did so while wearing her fine lace gloves. Her gloved fingers would hold the object at its very edge, a clear and deliberate communication that she would not, could not, allow her own skin to come into contact with the child's. It was a quiet, daily lesson in revulsion. It taught the girl that she was not just a servant, but a contaminant, something to be managed but never touched. Food was another instrument of this polite torture. Sarah Ann was not permitted to eat at a table, nor was she given a plate of her own. Her sustenance consisted of what was left over from the master and mistress's meals. But these scraps were not handed to her. They were placed on the stone floor near the hearth, often just beyond easy reach, forcing her to crawl on her hands and knees to retrieve a piece of cold biscuit or a strip of fatty meat. It was a ritual of abasement, a performance of her lowly status enacted 3 times a day. The master observed these small dramas with a detached disinterest. His world was one of ledgers and accounts, of the predictable mechanics of commerce. The household was his wife's domain. Its internal politics and quiet cruelties were of no concern to him, so long as the superficial order was maintained. In this landscape of silent domination, the girl learned to navigate the emotional currents of the house. She learned the specific creak of the floorboard that signaled the mistress's approach. She learned to interpret the subtle tightening of her mistress's lips, the faint, sharp intake of breath that preceded an act of displeasure. Her senses became acutely attuned to the atmosphere of the house, a house that seemed to have a life and a mood of its own. It was a place of perpetual dampness, where the chill of the stone walls seemed to seep into one's very bones. And there was a sound, a constant, unobtrusive rhythm that underscored the silence. It was the sound of dripping water, a slow, methodical metronome that seemed to emanate from somewhere beneath the house itself. It was a sound that one could almost forget until the dead of night, when all other noises ceased, and the steady, patient drip, drip, drip became the house's own faint heartbeat. There was one other soul on the property, a silent, weathered man named Isaac, the field hand. He was a figure who seemed to blend into the landscape, his movements slow and deliberate, his face a testament to a life of hard labor and quiet endurance. He was responsible for the small vegetable garden, the wood pile, the general upkeep of the grounds. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was a low murmur, as if he were reluctant to disturb the air. His brief, humanizing detail was a small, intricate bird he had once carved from a piece of scrap wood, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. A delicate creation he kept hidden in the woodshed. He and Sarah Ann shared a silent understanding, a communion of the unseen. They were part of the house's machinery, the silent cogs that allowed the lives of the master and mistress to function with seamless ease. One afternoon, as the winter light began to fail, the mistress instructed Sarah Ann to take a basket of turnips down to the root cellar. It was the first time the girl had been tasked with this specific chore. The door to the cellar was situated at the back of the kitchen, a heavy, forbidding slab of dark wood, reinforced with bands of rusted iron. A large, intricate keyhole was its only feature. As she approached it, the field hand, Isaac, who was carrying a load of firewood into the kitchen, paused. He did not look at her directly, but his eyes flickered towards the cellar door and then back to the floor. He spoke a single quiet sentence, his words barely a whisper. He told her never to look at the cellar door for too long. He said some things were best left unopened. It was not a warning born of superstition, but of a deep, ingrained knowledge of the house and its history. It was a piece of advice that the girl would file away in the archive of her mind. Another rule for survival in a place where the dangers were not always visible. The mistress unlocked the door with a heavy iron key, the sound of the tumblers turning echoing loudly in the quiet kitchen. A wave of cold, earthy air washed out, carrying with it the scent of damp soil, of decay, of something ancient and undisturbed. The smell was thick, cloying, entirely different from the clean, sterile cold of the house above. The stairs leading down were steep and made of rough-hewn stone, slick with a fine layer of moisture. The sound of dripping water was louder here, more immediate. It was the source. The mistress did not descend with her. She simply held the door open and pointed, her gloved hand indicating the darkness below. She told the child to be quick about it. Sarah Ann took the lantern and began her descent. The small flame cast dancing, distorted shadows on the stone walls. The air grew colder with each step, a profound, subterranean cold that felt as if it were radiating from the earth itself. The cellar was larger than she had imagined, a cavernous space with a low, arched ceiling. Barrels and crates were stacked against the walls, and bins held the meager harvest of potatoes, carrots, and turnips. The source of the dripping was a steady trickle of water that seeped through a crack in the far wall, collecting in a shallow, stagnant pool on the packed earth floor. The sound echoed, creating the illusion of multiple sources, of a place alive with a quiet, weeping misery. As she placed the turnips in their designated bin, she felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. It was a primal, instinctive feeling, the kind that raises the hair on the back of the neck. The lantern flame flickered, casting the shadows into a frantic dance. She turned, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, but there was nothing there. Only the oppressive dark, the damp stone, and the ceaseless, rhythmic dripping. She hurried back up the stairs, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. As she reached the top, the mistress was already closing the heavy door, her face impassive. The key turned in the lock, a sound of finality, of containment. The world of the cellar was sealed away once more, but its presence lingered. The scent of damp earth clung to the girl's clothes, and the sound of the dripping water now seemed louder in her memory, a permanent fixture in the soundscape of the house. The mistress said nothing about the girl's pale face or her trembling hands. She simply pointed to the hearth, indicating that it was time to add more wood to the fire. The routine of the house resumed its unyielding pace. But something had shifted. A new territory of fear had been introduced into the child's world. The cellar was not just a place for storing vegetables. It was a place of profound unease, a repository for the house's secrets. It was a place of punishment. And as the days grew shorter and the winter nights stretched into an endless expanse of darkness, Sarah Ann would come to learn that her descents into that cold, damp earth were only just beginning. The polite cruelty of the parlor was about to find a new, more terrifying expression in the darkness beneath the floorboards. The daily descent into the root cellar became a non-negotiable ritual, a punctuation mark at the end of each bleak afternoon. As the sun bled its last weak light behind the western mountains, casting the river valley in a deep and gathering gloom, the mistress would produce the heavy iron key. The chore was always the same: to carry down whatever vegetables had been designated for storage, or to bring up what was needed for the following day's meals. It was a simple, repetitive task. Yet for Sarah Ann, the turning of that key in the lock was the sound of a gate closing not just on a room, but on the world of light and air. The ritual was an exercise in conditioning, a methodical reinforcement of fear. The mistress seemed to derive a quiet, contained satisfaction from watching the girl's small shoulders tense at the sound of the lock, her face becoming a stoic, unreadable mask. It was a small, daily confirmation of her absolute power, her ownership not only of the child's labor, but of her terror as well. With each journey down those slick stone steps, the cellar became a more familiar, and therefore more menacing, territory. The girl's senses, sharpened by a need for survival, began to map the darkness in intricate detail. She knew the precise location of the loose stone on the third step. She knew the exact spot on the far wall where the relentless dripping was fastest, where the water had carved a faint, dark channel in the stone. She could navigate the narrow paths between the barrels and bins with her eyes closed, her memory guided by the varying textures of the packed earth floor. The smells became a complex language. The sharp, earthy scent of raw potatoes, the sweeter, cloying odor of turnips beginning to soften, and beneath it all, the ever-present foundational scent of mildew and cold, wet stone. It was the smell of a place that had never known the sun, a pocket of perpetual night sealed beneath the living house. It was in this sensory landscape, this world of dampness and decay, that she first began to hear the other sound. It was not the drip of the water. It was not the scuttling of unseen rodents in the walls. It was something far more subtle, a sound she initially dismissed as a trick of her own ears, an auditory illusion born of the oppressive silence. It was a faint, rhythmic exhalation, like a slow and shallow breath drawn and released in the deepest corner of the cellar, the corner where the darkness was most absolute. At first, she would freeze, the lantern held high, its light pushing back the shadows but revealing nothing. The sound would cease the moment she stopped moving, the moment her own breathing and the frantic beat of her own heart became the loudest things in the subterranean world. She told herself it was the wind, a draft working its way through some unseen crack in the foundation. She told herself it was the house settling, the groaning of old wood and stone. But the sound had a quality that defied these rational explanations. It was organic, it was patient, and it was always there, waiting for her in the silence between the drips of water. She never spoke of it. To give voice to the fear would be to give it substance, to invite a scrutiny she could not afford. The mistress's cruelty was predictable, a known variable in her daily equation for survival. The breathing in the dark was an unknown, a terrifying mystery she had to navigate alone. The field hand, Isaac, continued his silent orbit around the property. He was a man who seemed to communicate more with his presence than with his words. He saw the way the girl flinched when the cellar key was brought out. He saw the pallor of her skin when she emerged from the darkness, the way she would stand by the kitchen fire for a long time afterward, as if trying to bake the subterranean chill from her bones. One afternoon, While he was mending a split in the woodshed wall, Sarah Ann was tasked with gathering kindling nearby. He did not stop his work, his hands moving with a slow, practiced economy. Without looking up, he spoke, his voice low and even. He told her that the house was younger than the stones it stood on. He gestured with his chin toward the corner of the main house, where the foundation was visible. He explained that some of those stones were from an older building, a property that had stood on this very spot long before the Whitleys arrived. It had belonged to a man whose cruelty was a local legend, a man who had worked his enslaved laborers to death and buried them where they fell, without marker or prayer. He said that when they dug the foundation for the new house, they had turned up bones. The builders, he murmured, had simply dug them deeper and laid the new stones on top. The cellar, he said, was the deepest part of the new foundation. It sat directly over the old, unhallowed ground. His words were not a ghost story told for a fright. They were delivered as a piece of history, a factual account of the soil on which she walked, the soil in which the house was rooted. The information settled upon the girl not with a shock, but with a dreadful sense of confirmation. It gave a potential source to the breathing in the dark. It lent a history to the oppressive sorrow that seemed to seep from the cellar walls. The space beneath the house was not just a cellar. It was a tomb. The knowledge changed the nature of her fear. It was no longer a vague and formless dread, but a specific, localized horror. She was not just entering a cold, dark room. She was descending into a grave. The faint breathing she heard was no longer the wind. It was the restless, unquiet breath of the forgotten dead, their presence a permanent feature of the house's geography. The single heavy chain she had once noticed embedded in the far wall, its purpose a mystery, now seemed a clear and terrible artifact. It was a remnant of the older world, a piece of the cruelty that had soaked into the very earth. The cellar was a place where the air never warmed because it was saturated with a cold that was not of any season. It was the cold of a long and unremembered agony. The mistress's paranoia, which had always been a quiet, simmering current in the household, began to escalate. She started to see infringements and failures in every corner. A speck of dust on a mantelpiece, a floorboard that was not swept perfectly clean. These were not mere oversights in her eyes. They were acts of deliberate defiance, small rebellions that threatened the perfect, rigid order she had constructed around herself. And her punishments began to center, with an almost obsessive focus, on the root cellar. It began with small extensions of time. A task that should have taken 2 minutes was now expected to be completed in 1. And when the child failed, she was ordered to stand on the cellar steps for 5 minutes, then 10. The open door, a constant reminder of the darkness just beyond. The true escalation, however, began on a Tuesday. The infraction was a small one. A teacup, rinsed and placed on the drying rack, had slipped and shattered on the stone floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent kitchen. The mistress did not rage. Her reaction was far more chilling. She looked at the broken pieces of porcelain, then at the girl, her face a mask of cold disappointment. She said that carelessness was a symptom of a disorderly mind, and that a disorderly mind required a period of quiet reflection in a place free from distraction. She took the iron key, led Sarah Ann to the cellar door, and ordered her inside. This time, however, she handed the girl a single tallow candle, a small, meager source of light. She said that the girl was to remain in the cellar until the candle had burned itself out. That would be a sufficient amount of time, she explained, to contemplate her mistake. Then, for the first time, the mistress followed her down 2 steps. Sarah Ann descended into the familiar cold, the small flame of the candle pushing back a circle of darkness no bigger than a kitchen table. She heard the mistress ascend the steps behind her. She heard the heavy wooden door groan shut, plunging the top of the stairwell into shadow. And then she heard the sound that would define the next stage of her existence. It was the sound of the heavy iron key turning in the lock from the outside. The sharp metallic clank echoed down the stone steps, a sound of absolute finality. She was no longer a visitor to the darkness. She was its prisoner. The silence that followed was profound, deeper than any she had ever experienced. The world of the house above, with its creaking floors and distant sounds, was gone, sealed away behind the thick door. Her entire universe had contracted to the small, flickering circle of candlelight. The dripping of the water was now impossibly loud, a relentless, echoing percussion in the stillness. The air was thick and heavy in her lungs, tasting of damp earth and the faint, sweet smell of rot from a far corner. She stood frozen at the bottom of the steps, her gaze fixed on the candle flame. It was her only connection to the world of light, her only measure of time. She watched the flame consume the tallow, the wax melting and running down the side in thick, slow tears. The breathing sound was there, waiting in the darkness just beyond the edge of her light. It seemed closer now, more distinct, as if its source was emboldened by her captivity. Was it one breath, or many? Was it a sigh of sorrow, or something else entirely? A question she could not allow her mind to form completely. Her eyes scanned the familiar objects, now rendered strange and monstrous by the dancing shadows. A stack of empty crates looked like a crouched figure. The long, dark tines of a pitchfork leaning against the wall seemed to reach for her. And there was the chain, hanging from the wall, its rusted surface catching the faint, flickering light. She could see it more clearly now. It was thick, the links heavy and crude. It emerged from between two of the large foundation stones and disappeared into the packed earth of the floor. A tether, a shackle, a piece of the story the field hand had told her, made real and tangible. How many souls had been bound by that very chain? Whose agony had seeped into the iron and the stone? Terror was a physical thing. It was the cold that seeped up through the soles of her thin shoes. It was the frantic, bird-like flutter in her chest. It was the metallic taste in her mouth. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury, a release that the rigid discipline of her life had taught her to suppress. Instead, she watched the candle. The flame began to sputter. It shrank, pulling into itself, the light becoming a weak, pale blue. The pool of melted wax at its base was consumed. She held her breath, watching the last desperate dance of the wick. For a moment, it flared, a final surge of brightness that cast one last, sharp set of shadows across the stone walls. And then, with a final faint hiss and a wisp of greasy smoke, it was gone. The darkness that rushed in was absolute. It was a physical presence, a thick, black velvet that pressed against her eyes, her skin. It was disorienting, suffocating. She could hear nothing but the dripping water and the slow, steady breathing that was not her own. The cellar was no longer just a room. It was an entity. It was alive with the memory of its own past, a past built on a foundation of bones. Fear had taken root in this place where light could not reach, and now, locked in the heart of it, the girl began to understand that the haunting was not just in the cellar. The true haunting was in the calculated, quiet cruelty of the woman who had locked the door. The woman who had condemned her to this time in the cold and the dark, with nothing for company but the ghosts she and her house had made. The discipline was just beginning. The lock on the cellar door became a fixture in the oral landscape of the house, its sharp metallic report a regular and dreaded occurrence. The duration of the girl's confinement grew, marked by the lifespan of a single candle, then two. Time in the darkness was a fluid, unknowable thing. It stretched and compressed, measured only by the slow, rhythmic consumption of tallow and wick. Sarah Ann learned to endure it. She would sit on the lowest stone step, her back pressed against the cold, damp wall, and retreat into the fortress of her own mind. She would trace the lines of the stones with her fingers, memorizing their texture. She would count the drips of water, creating complex rhythms and patterns to occupy the silence. She developed a tolerance for the fear, a numb acceptance of the breathing in the dark. It became a companion of sorts, a constant, unseen presence in her solitary confinement. This new, intensified phase of cruelty was orchestrated solely by the mistress. Mr. Thomas Whitley remained a distant, peripheral figure, his days consumed by his business at the armory and his evenings by his ledgers. He was either oblivious to the escalating terror within his own home, or had chosen a path of deliberate, strategic ignorance. The house was his wife's world, and he did not interfere. The fragile ecosystem of the household, a tense balance of power between master, mistress, and the enslaved, was about to be irrevocably disrupted. The disruption arrived in the form of a letter, bearing a Baltimore postmark. Mr. Whitley announced at breakfast that he was required to travel on urgent business. He would be gone for a fortnight, perhaps longer. He gave his wife a list of instructions regarding the household accounts and packed a small, practical valise. His departure was as methodical and devoid of sentiment as all his other actions. He wound his pocket watch, placed it in his waistcoat, and left the house, without a backward glance. His absence created a power vacuum, a sudden and total removal of the one, albeit passive, check on the mistress's authority. With her husband gone, Eleanor Whitley's world contracted to the confines of the stone house and the two souls within it, herself and the child who was the sole object of her increasingly volatile attention. The quiet, simmering engine of her cruelty, no longer needing to maintain the pretense of domestic order for her husband, began to run hot. The days without witness descended into a new kind of hell. The structured, polite cruelties of the past were abandoned in favor of a raw, untempered sadism. Food became a weapon of absolute control. Days would pass when Sarah Ann was given nothing but a cup of brackish water. Sleep was a privilege to be earned, not a right. The girl was assigned an endless series of punishing tasks that kept her awake long into the night and roused her before the first hint of dawn. She scrubbed floors until her knees were raw, polished silver that was already gleaming, and mended linens until her vision blurred and her small fingers cramped. The mistress would watch her, a silent, predatory stillness in her posture, her eyes following the child's every movement. The humming, that last ghost of a forgotten melody, ceased entirely. It was replaced by a tense, unnerving silence, broken only by the sharp, clipped commands she would issue. The house itself seemed to absorb the rising tension. The air grew thick and heavy, oppressive. Despite the deepening winter outside, the mistress insisted on keeping a fire roaring in the parlor hearth at all times, day and night. The heat was suffocating, a dry, baking warmth that seemed to suck the very moisture from the air, making the chill of the cellar when the door was opened feel even more profound and shocking. The escalating mania culminated on a Tuesday, 1 week after the master's departure. It was late in the evening. A fine, persistent sleet had begun to fall outside, ticking against the window panes like tiny, insistent fingers. Sarah Ann was on her hands and knees in the parlor, attempting to scrub a small, imagined scuff mark from the wide plank flooring, her movements slow and clumsy with exhaustion. The mistress stood by the mantelpiece, her silhouette stark and rigid against the roaring fire. For a long time, she said nothing, The only sounds were the crackle of the flames, the hiss of the sleet against the glass, and the rhythmic scrub of the girl's brush against the wood. Then, the mistress spoke, her voice unnaturally calm. She accused the girl of insolence. She claimed to have seen a flicker of defiance in the child's eyes, a silent, rebellious thought. The accusation was absurd, a projection of her own spiraling paranoia. But in that moment, it was her absolute reality. What happened next was a blur of violent, disjointed motion. The mistress's hand shot out and seized one of the heavy, sterling, silver candlesticks from the mantel. It was a substantial object, its base wide and weighted. She raised it high, her face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The firelight caught the polished silver, making it gleam like a weapon. The girl had no time to react, to even process the intent. The candlestick came down in a vicious, sweeping arc. It did not strike the child's head, a mercy of either poor aim or a last vestigial shred of restraint. Instead, it caught her on the shoulder, a solid, sickening impact of metal against bone. The force of the blow sent Sarah Ann sprawling sideways onto the crimson and gold carpet runner that stretched the length of the parlor. Pain, sharp and blinding, exploded in her shoulder. But it was the sight of the blood that truly registered. A thin, dark line of it was welling from a cut on her upper arm, soaking into the thin fabric of her dress. A single, perfect drop fell from her arm and landed on the intricate golden pattern of the runner. A stark, vivid crimson stain against the yellow thread. The sight of the blood seemed to break the spell. The mistress froze, the candlestick still clutched in her hand. Her chest was heaving, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked from the blood on the carpet to the weapon in her hand, to the small, crumpled figure of the child on the floor. An expression of something akin to horror flickered across her features, a sudden, terrifying awareness of her own actions. The rage drained away as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a chilling, unnerving calm. She did not move to help the girl. She did not offer a word of comfort or remorse. She simply stood, her eyes wide and unfocused, as if she were seeing not only the scene before her, but some other, more terrible vision within her own mind. The house fell silent once more. The only sounds now the fire and the storm. The violence, once it had finally erupted from the realm of the psychological into the physical, had left behind a vacuum. It was a terrified, watchful stillness, the kind that follows a lightning strike when the world holds its breath, waiting for the thunder. In that moment, the relationship between the two of them was fundamentally and irrevocably altered. The girl, lying on the floor with blood seeping into her sleeve, looked at the woman by the fire. She was no longer just a mistress, a figure of authority. She was a force of pure, unpredictable chaos, a mind that had clearly fractured. And in a household with no witnesses, a fractured mind was the most dangerous thing in the world. The question was no longer simply how to survive the mistress's cruelty. The question had become how to survive the mistress herself. The parlor, with its oppressive heat and the new dark stain on the runner, had become a crucible. The girl's innocence, already so heavily burdened, was being burned away, leaving behind something harder, something colder. Something that was learning to watch and to wait. After a long, silent moment that seemed to stretch for an eternity, the mistress slowly, deliberately, placed the candlestick back on the mantel. She turned, without a word, and walked out of the room, her footsteps receding down the hall. She vanished from public view, retreating into the upper floors of the house, leaving the girl alone with the pain in her shoulder, the blood on the carpet, and the chilling certainty that the final act of this terrible drama had now begun. the house settled into a new and deeply unsettling rhythm. For 2 full days following the violent outburst in the parlor, the mistress remained secluded in her upstairs bedroom. The silence from above was more unnerving than her rages had been. It was an absence that felt like a presence, a watchful, brooding quiet that permeated every room. Sarah Ann became the sole custodian of the household's functions. She moved with a practiced, ghost-like efficiency, her every action dictated by a desperate need for invisibility. Her shoulder throbbed with a deep, persistent ache, a constant physical reminder of the boundary that had been crossed. She tended the fires, swept the floors, and prepared small, simple meals that she would leave on a tray outside the mistress's closed door. The trays would eventually be retrieved, the food sometimes eaten, sometimes not. No words were exchanged. The thick oak of the bedroom door was a barrier as absolute as the stone walls of the cellar. During this period of isolation, the girl's mind worked with a clarity and focus born of pure necessity. She was no longer just a victim enduring her fate. She was an intelligence operative in hostile territory, gathering information, assessing threats, and formulating a strategy for survival. The central, unavoidable fact was the mistress's instability. The child understood, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the woman upstairs was a danger not only to her, but potentially to herself. The order of the house had not just collapsed, it had inverted. The enslaved child was now the keeper of its fragile peace, the manager of its unraveling mistress. The first test of this new reality arrived on the 3rd morning, in the form of a carriage pulling up the long, winding drive. It was the neighbor from the adjacent property, a woman known as Mistress Pike. She was a portly, officious woman whose visits were a regular feature of the local social landscape, a way of gathering and disseminating the small currents of gossip that were the lifeblood of their isolated community. Her arrival sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Sarah Ann, a witness, an outsider. The fragile, terrifying equilibrium of the past 2 days was about to be shattered. The girl's mind, operating with a speed and cunning she did not know she possessed, raced through 1,000 possibilities. What would the mistress do? Would she emerge from her room, her eyes wild, her temper a loaded pistol? Would she remain hidden, forcing the girl to explain her absence? The potential for disaster was immense. As the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the silent house, a decision was made. It was not a conscious, deliberate choice, but an instinctual act of self-preservation, as swift and certain as a flinch from a hot flame. Sarah Ann walked to the front door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She opened it just wide enough to see the neighbor's broad, inquisitive face. Before Mistress Pike could even utter a greeting, the girl spoke. Her voice was quiet, steady, and imbued with a strange, adult gravity. She reported that Mistress Whitley had been feeling unwell for several days and, just that morning, had decided to depart on an impromptu visit to her cousins in Shepherdstown, believing a change of scenery would aid her recovery. The lie was simple, plausible, and delivered with a directness that gave it the weight of truth. The girl added a small, corroborating detail, explaining that the mistress had left very early, before dawn, to catch the first ferry. The neighbor's face registered a flicker of surprise, then acceptance. It was, after all, a perfectly reasonable explanation. She expressed her regrets at having missed her friend and conveyed her wishes for a speedy recovery. She asked if Mr. Whitley was at home, and the girl dutifully reported that he was still away in Baltimore on business. The neighbor nodded, her mind already cataloging this new information for her next social call. She remarked that the poor child must have her hands full, running the house all by herself. She did not notice the faint, dark bruise on the girl's cheek, or the way she held her left shoulder at a slightly stiff, unnatural angle. she saw only a quiet, competent servant girl, relaying a piece of domestic news. The performance was flawless. The neighbor turned and lumbered back to her carriage, and as it rattled away down the drive, Sarah Ann closed the door, the lie hanging in the air between them like a newly constructed wall. It was a wall that protected the house's dark secret, and in doing so, protected her. She had learned in that brief, terrifying exchange that a well-crafted falsehood could be a more effective shield than silence had ever been. Survival now required a new and far more complex performance. The lie had to be maintained. It had to be fed and cared for, lest it wither and die under the harsh light of scrutiny. The first order of business was to erase any evidence that contradicted the story. Her first act was to address the parlor. She took a basin of cold water and a stiff brush and knelt by the crimson runner. The spot of blood was small, but to her eyes, it was a glaring confession. She scrubbed at the stain, her movements methodical and precise, until the dark spot had faded into a faint, brownish discoloration, easily mistaken for a shadow or a bit of spilled wine. Next, she turned her attention to the mail. A letter had arrived for the mistress, a piece of correspondence from a friend in Richmond. To leave it unanswered would arouse suspicion. The girl took the letter to the small writing desk in the master's study. She had, on countless occasions, watched her mistress write. She had studied the elegant, looping script, the particular way she formed her capital letters. With a trembling hand, she dipped the pen in the inkwell. On a piece of scrap paper, she practiced, imitating the flourishes and slants of her mistress's hand. Her first few attempts were clumsy, a child's scrawl. But she persisted, her focus absolute. Finally, she produced a passable imitation. She penned a short, simple reply. The note explained that she was writing from her cousin's home, that she was feeling much better, and that she would provide a more detailed account of her travels upon her return. She signed it with her mistress's name, the ink flowing in a close approximation of the familiar signature. She sealed the letter, her heart a cold, heavy knot in her chest. She had moved from passive concealment to active forgery. Each act of deception pulled her deeper into the conspiracy, making her not just a victim, but an accomplice in the strange, silent disappearance of Eleanor Whitley. That night, a heavy snow began to fall. It came down in thick, silent flakes, blanketing the world in a pristine, unblemished white. The snow muffled all sound, creating a profound and isolating silence. The house felt more cut off from the world than ever before. A lone, dark island in a sea of white. It was in this deep, snow-induced quiet that the new sound began. It was not the breathing in the cellar. It was something different. It was a faint, intermittent scratching. It seemed to come from directly beneath the floorboards of the kitchen, the very room where she now spent most of her waking and sleeping hours, huddled for warmth by the dying embers of the hearth. At first, she dismissed it. Rats. The old house was surely full of them, driven inside by the cold. It was a logical, rational explanation. But the sound had a quality that gnawed at the edges of her reason. It was not the frantic, skittering sound of vermin. It was slower, more deliberate. It had a rhythm. Scratch, pause, scratch, scratch, pause. It was a sound that seemed to carry with it a desperate, methodical intent. She would lie on her thin pallet on the floor, her eyes wide open in the dark, listening. The sound would stop and start, sometimes continuing for nearly an hour before falling silent again. The snow outside muted the world, but inside the house, the scratching beneath her feet became the only sound in the universe. A terrible, secret heartbeat counting out the slow, dark hours. The lie she had told had created a fragile peace, But the sound from beneath the floorboards suggested a horrifying possibility, that the truth was not silent, and it was trying to claw its way out. The child had learned that a performance could ensure her survival, but she was now beginning to understand that the role she was playing might require her to become the sole audience for a horror she herself had set in motion. The lie, once spoken, took on a life of its own, settling over the Whitley house like the deep, sound-dampening snow that now blanketed Harper's Ferry. It was an elegant solution to an immediate crisis, and it proved remarkably durable. The deception was sustained not so much by the girl's cunning, but by the simple, unthinking acceptance of those around her. The world, it turned out, was predisposed to believe the most plausible and least disturbing version of events. When the baker's boy made his weekly delivery, he heard the faint scratching from beneath the kitchen floor and remarked that the winter was driving the rats inside. Sarah Ann simply nodded in agreement, her face a placid mask. A traveling preacher, stopping to ask for a cup of water, heard the same intermittent sound and offered a prayer for the Lord to deliver them from the pestilence of vermin. Each casual dismissal, each logical explanation offered by an outsider, served to reinforce the public narrative while simultaneously deepening the girl's private, gnawing horror. She was trapped in a strange and terrible paradox. The sound that was slowly eroding her sanity was the very thing that protected her secret. As long as it was rats, the world would ask no further questions. The community, small and insular as it was, functioned on a network of shared assumptions. It was assumed that a woman like Eleanor Whitley would, if feeling unwell, visit relatives. It was assumed that a house as old as theirs would be plagued by rats. It was assumed that the quiet, enslaved girl was simply carrying out her duties in the absence of her masters. These assumptions formed a protective cocoon around the house and its terrible secret. The servants from neighboring properties, when they encountered Sarah Ann at the town well, would hear the rhythmic scraping coming from the house's foundation as they passed. They too dismissed it. Their own homes had similar issues. Winter was a time of infestation. They spoke of traps and poisons, of cats and terriers. Their conversation was practical, mundane, and utterly oblivious to the true nature of the sound. This chorus of misinterpretation had a profound psychological effect on the girl. Was it possible that they were right? Could it be that her own mind, overwrought with fear and guilt, was imbuing a simple, natural sound with a terrifying significance it did not possess? She clung to this possibility, this fragile thread of rational explanation, during the long hours of the day. But the nights offered no such comfort. In the profound, snow-enforced silence of the deep winter nights, the scratching would begin anew. It was a patient, persistent sound, a methodical working at the boundaries between one world and the next. It was the sound of a living thing attempting to communicate or to escape. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and fraught with nightmares. Sarah Ann began to dream of the mistress. In these dreams, Eleanor Whitley was not the raging, violent figure from the parlor, nor the cold, cruel automaton of the preceding months. She was a disembodied voice, a mournful, whispering presence that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the house. The voice would speak her name, the sound distorted and elongated, as if filtered through packed earth and stone. It would ask for water. It would beg for a sliver of light. The dreams were so vivid, so viscerally real, that she would often wake with a gasp, her body drenched in a cold sweat, the phantom words still echoing in the silent kitchen. She would lie on her pallet, listening, and the scratching from beneath the floor would seem like a direct, physical answer to the pleas in her dream. The line between the sleeping and the waking world, between the imagined and the real, began to blur. The house was no longer a simple structure of stone and wood. It was becoming a resonant chamber for her guilt, a place where the walls themselves seemed to have absorbed her secret and were now playing it back to her in a terrifying, unending loop. The field hand, Isaac, had been absent since the day of the master's departure. His work on the property concluded for the harshest part of the winter. He returned unexpectedly near the end of the second week, dispatched by Mr. Whitley's solicitor to ensure a supply of firewood had been maintained. He was a man of the earth, his senses attuned to the subtle, unspoken language of the natural world. He noticed the change in the girl immediately. He saw the new, dark circles under her eyes, the way she started at the slightest sound. He did not ask questions. He was not a man who pried into the affairs of others, but he was an observer. As he worked, splitting logs in the silent, snow-covered yard, he could hear the sound. He paused, his axe held motionless in his powerful hands, his head cocked to one side. He had heard the sounds of rats before, the frantic scrabbling of claws, the high-pitched squeals. This was not that. This was a slower, more deliberate rhythm. It was a sound with a different weight, a different meaning. That night, a deep and bitter cold descended on the valley. The river froze near the banks, and the snow on the ground crunched underfoot with a sound like breaking glass. The field hand, having finished his work, did not leave immediately. He lingered, a silent, watchful guardian. He saw the single candle burning in the kitchen window, the only sign of life in the dark, imposing house. He must have seen the girl's shadow moving back and forth, a small, lonely figure pacing in the faint light. What drove him to act is a question the record cannot answer. Perhaps it was a sense of responsibility, a flicker of compassion, or simply an unbearable curiosity about the sound that so clearly did not belong. He approached the house, not from the front, but from the side, moving with the quiet, practiced stealth of a man who knew the land. He made his way to the kitchen, where the foundation stones were lowest to the ground, where the sound was most distinct. He carried with him a small, flat pry bar from the woodshed. Sarah Ann, huddled by the hearth, heard a new noise, a faint metallic scraping from outside, near the base of the wall. Then, the distinct groaning of old wood being subjected to immense pressure. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The rhythmic scratching from beneath the floor ceased abruptly, as if its source was also listening. She crept to the window and peered out into the moonless, snow-lit night. She saw him. Isaac. A dark, powerful silhouette against the white ground, hunched over, working at something near the foundation. He was prying at the edge of one of the wide, heavy planks that formed the floor of the kitchen's small, external pantry. The floorboards there were known to be looser, subject to the dampness that seeped up from the ground. She watched, mesmerized by a mixture of terror and a strange, desperate hope. What would he find? Would he expose her lie? Would he end the torment of the sound? He worked for several minutes, the only sounds the creak of the wood and his own low, steady grunts of exertion. Finally, with a sharp crack, a section of the floor planking gave way. He had created an opening, a dark, narrow gap that led into the crawl space beneath the house, adjacent to the stone wall of the root cellar. He knelt, his face close to the opening. He did not have a lantern. He was peering into absolute blackness. He remained there for a long, silent moment, perfectly still. And then he recoiled. It was not a sudden, startled movement. It was a slow, deliberate retreat, as if he were pulling back from the edge of a great abyss. He rose to his feet, his body rigid. He turned his head and looked directly at the kitchen window, directly at the spot where the girl was watching, though he could not possibly have seen her in the darkness. His face, illuminated for a moment by the faint reflected light from the snow, was a mask of pure, undiluted terror. It was a look of such profound horror that it seemed to strip the years from his weathered features, leaving behind the wide, staring eyes of a frightened child. He turned, without a sound, and fled. He did not run in a panic. He moved with a swift, purposeful stride, away from the house, melting into the darkness of the trees at the edge of the property. He did not look back. He was never seen in Harper's Ferry again. The girl was left alone once more, the silence in the kitchen now heavier, more complete than ever before. The scratching did not resume. Isaac's flight was a confirmation more terrifying than any sound. What he had seen, or heard, or smelled in that dark opening had been enough to make a strong, stoic man abandon everything and flee into the frozen night. The question of whether the sound was real or imagined was now answered. It was real. The question of what it was, however, remained. The horror now had a new dimension. It was not just a sound in the dark or a ghost in a dream. It was a tangible, physical reality, a thing so terrible that a single glimpse of it could sever a man's connection to the world he knew. The embers in the hearth glowed a dull, dying red. The kitchen was growing cold. Outside, the world was white and silent. Inside, the girl sat alone in the dark, the unseen corpse beneath her feet now a confirmed and terrifying presence. A final visitor was approaching, his journey already underway. A man of science, a man of logic, whose arrival would force the cellar to finally give up its dead. The haunting was about to become an excavation. The arrival of the physician was not an act of suspicion, but one of pure, mundane coincidence. He was a traveling doctor, a man named Alistair Finch, whose circuit brought him through the more remote communities of the Virginia mountains every third month. His one small, humanizing detail was an almost fanatical devotion to his dog, a scruffy but keenly intelligent terrier who rode beside him in his buggy. Dr. Finch was a man of science and observation, his mind trained to see the world in terms of symptoms and diagnoses, causes and effects. He had been a correspondent of Thomas Whitley's on matters of local botany, and his stop at the house was intended as a simple social call, a chance to discuss a new species of fern he had identified in the upper elevations. He arrived on a brilliantly cold morning, the sun glinting off the pristine snow, the air so crisp it seemed to crackle. His buggy, with its single energetic horse, was a stark black shape against the vast whiteness of the landscape. Sarah Ann saw him coming up the long drive, and her blood ran cold. A man of medicine, of formal education. He was not a superstitious neighbor or a simple baker's boy. His eyes were trained to see things that others missed, to notice the subtle signs of illness, of disorder, of things not being as they should. The lie, which had held for so long against the casual inquiries of the community, felt suddenly fragile, a thin and brittle shell about to be shattered by the doctor's professional scrutiny. She opened the door to his knock, her prepared speech about the mistress's visit to her cousins ready on her lips. The doctor was a kindly-looking man, his face weathered by the elements, his eyes sharp and inquisitive. He listened patiently to her story, his head tilted with a polite, professional sympathy. He expressed his regret and was about to turn and leave when his terrier, which had been sniffing intently at the base of the front door, suddenly let out a series of sharp, insistent yaps. The dog was agitated. It scratched at the floorboards near the threshold, its tail erect, its entire body quivering with a hunter's intensity. Dr. Finch, amused at first, tried to calm the animal, apologizing for its behavior. But the terrier was relentless. It ignored its master's commands, its focus absolute. It ran from the front door into the main hall, and then, its nose to the floor, followed an invisible trail directly into the kitchen. There, it stopped dead. It stood over the exact spot where the scratching had been most persistent, its body rigid, a low, guttural growl rumbling deep in its chest. The dog was scenting something. Something that, to its primal predatory senses, signaled death and decay. It was a scent that the human occupants of the house had either grown accustomed to or had failed to register. A faint, sweetish, earthy odor that had become part of the house's unique atmospheric signature. But to the dog, it was a clarion call, an undeniable announcement of the presence of a corpse. The doctor's demeanor changed. The polite sympathy vanished, replaced by a focused professional curiosity. He was no longer a social caller. He was a diagnostician, and the house itself was his patient. He asked the girl, his voice now carrying a new weight of authority, what was beneath the kitchen floor. She replied, her voice a thin, reedy whisper, that it was only the root cellar. He noted the faint, dark discoloration on the parlor runner. He saw the tremor in the girl's hands, the deep, haunted shadows beneath her eyes. The carefully constructed facade of normalcy was crumbling, piece by piece, under his methodical gaze. He commanded her to show him the cellar. His tone was not cruel, but it was absolute, leaving no room for argument or evasion. Trembling, the girl retrieved the heavy iron key. The act of inserting it into the lock and turning the tumblers felt like a final, irrevocable confession. As the heavy door swung inward, a wave of cold, stagnant air washed out, and with it, the scent. It was stronger here, more concentrated. The smell of damp earth, of mildew, and of something else. The smell of slow, inexorable decay. The doctor produced a modern phosphorus match from a small tin box, a marvel of new technology, and lit a lantern he had retrieved from his buggy. He did not ask the girl to accompany him. He descended the stone steps alone, his small dog darting ahead of him, its growls now turning into frantic, excited barks. The doctor's lantern cast a steady, unwavering light into the subterranean darkness, a light of scientific inquiry that was far different from the fearful, flickering flame of a tallow candle. He was down there for what felt like an eternity. The girl remained at the top of the stairs, a silent, frozen statue, listening to the sounds from below. The doctor's calm, measured footsteps, the scraping of a boot against stone, the occasional low murmur as he made an observation to himself. And then, a new sound. The sound of digging, the rhythmic scrape and thud of a shovel biting into the packed earth of the cellar floor. The dog's barking had pinpointed a specific location, a section of the floor in the far corner, near the wall where the rusted chain was embedded. It was a spot where the earth was slightly raised, slightly softer than the surrounding ground. The digging continued for several minutes, a grim, methodical excavation. Then silence. A deep, profound silence that seemed to draw all the air from the house. When the doctor finally emerged from the cellar, his face was pale and set like a granite stone. He did not need to speak. The truth was written in the grim line of his mouth, in the haunted look in his sharp, intelligent eyes. He had found her. He had unearthed the entombed body of Eleanor Whitley. He brought the girl into the parlor and sat her down. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten or accuse. He simply asked her to tell him what had happened. And the story, the true story, came spilling out of her. It was not a confession in the legal sense of the word. It was a calm, almost detached explanation, a recitation of facts delivered in a flat, emotionless voice. She told him of the escalating cruelty, of the candlestick, of the blood on the runner. She explained what had happened in the aftermath of the attack. The mistress, in a state of agitated delirium, had descended into the cellar in the middle of the night, claiming she heard voices from the old graves below. She had ordered the girl to follow her, to fetch a lantern, to bring light into the darkness where the ghosts were whispering. But the girl had not fetched the light. She described her final action with a chilling, irrefutable logic. She said the mistress had told her to fetch light, so she had closed the door to keep out the dark. It was the explanation of a child who had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, a mind that had found its own terrible way to restore order to a chaotic and violent world. To her, closing the door was not an act of murder. It was an act of obedience, an act of survival. The authorities were summoned. The town magistrate, a portly, self-important man, arrived with the local sheriff. The official proceedings were a perfunctory, almost theatrical affair. The primary concern was not justice, but the containment of a scandal. The Whitleys were a respectable family. The notion that one of their own had been entombed alive by an 11-year-old enslaved girl was a story too horrifying, too disruptive to the town's carefully maintained social order. The matter was handled with a cold, bureaucratic efficiency. The official report, penned in the magistrate's looping, self-satisfied script, concluded that the mistress, in a state of mental derangement, had accidentally locked herself in the cellar and succumbed to the cold. The girl's testimony was dismissed as the frightened fantasy of an unreliable child. It was the neatest, cleanest, and most convenient version of the truth. It required no trial, no public inquiry, no uncomfortable examination of the quiet horrors that had been unfolding within the stone walls of the Whitley house. By the time the first thaws of spring had begun to soften the iron-hard ground, Sarah Ann Coleman had been sold. The transaction was handled quietly, the paperwork expedited. She was sent south to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, her name and her story erased from the local record, absorbed into the vast anonymous machinery of human bondage. Her ultimate fate is unknown. The house was sold. The cellar was bricked up, its dark entrance sealed behind a wall of new stone and mortar, as if the very memory of the space could be physically contained. And yet, the story lingered. Not in the official records, but in the quiet, whispered folklore of the town. For generations, it was said that on damp nights, when the river was high and the fog rolled in from the water, you could still hear something from the old Whitley place. A faint, rhythmic scratching, the sound of something trying to get out. The truth, in a place like Harper's Ferry, was never truly unearthed for the sake of justice. It was unearthed out of a fleeting, morbid curiosity, and then, finding it too unsettling, it was buried again, deeper and more permanently than before. The case file on Sarah Ann Coleman is now closed. The case file on Sarah Ann Coleman is now closed. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to stand among those present when the next is opened, and leave your thoughts on what you have witnessed.